Hi, we continue in Genesis 50 today as we near the very end of the chapter and the entire book of Genesis with one more major scene that expresses, despite the various actions that we've seen between Joseph and his brothers and Jacob and Joseph and Jacob and his sons, the brothers are still terrified of Joseph. And as we'll see, it's now been a full 40 years since they mistreated Joseph back when he came to them out when they were shepherds, and now they're still concerned about that. So as we look at this, we need to consider a number of elements. As we see the scene on the right side of the screen, the Egyptians are gone. The whole question of land seems to be gone. It's just down to the family question. But the family question is never separate from the national question. And as we've seen, the name Israel has now been used to refer to the people and not just their father Jacob. And so what we can note in the last scene was the Egyptian leaders, the elders, as well as the slaves of Pharaoh, who accompanied them all to Canaan, did that freely with apparently no concern that they were in a foreign land. And there are a couple of questions we can ask about that. One has to do with when we're imagining the story takes place. If it's during the time of exile or after exile, as some scholars have recently suggested, then why put the Egyptians in Canaan in particular? The Babylonians, who would be at issue, were certainly not directly in Canaan. If it's, as Brett suggests, from the time of the Persians afterwards, well, the Persians certainly had control over Jerusalem and were colonizing what they called Yehud and would have been free to move all around there. In fact, Ezra and Nehemiah are certainly their people in Jerusalem, in the rebuilding of Jerusalem. But if, as I've been suggesting in this section on Joseph, that this story is written in the time of the Egyptian Seleucid control over the area, roughly after the time of Alexander the Great in the late 3rd and early 2nd century BCE, before they were conquered by the Seleucids, which is something that went back and forth between them until the Romans solved the problem in terms of Greek influence there between the Seleucids and the Ptolemies. So if it's the Ptolemies who are the background of the story, we can easily imagine them going freely into Canaan, a land that, if not a colony of theirs, is certainly one they exercise hegemony over. And we can also note there's a cyclical element to the entire relationship of Joseph and his brothers and the Egyptians, because one of the first lies he stated openly to them was to accuse them of being spies, that you've come to look on the nakedness of the land. And that's, of course, exactly what the Egyptians just did. It wasn't their purpose. They were coming to mourn Jacob. But it wasn't the brothers' purpose either, but it didn't stop Joseph from accusing them falsely of that. Now the Egyptians, who have reason to want to spy on the land, if they're still concerned about food, then they have a reason to want to know what the land is of the people who are outside of Egypt and how dependent they might be on Egyptian grain that Joseph has done such a good job of commandeering for profit. So all those questions are at issue in the background, despite the fact that we just simply see Joseph and the brothers. And one more element. We note that as the scene starts, after he buried his father, Joseph returned to Egypt with his brothers. And one of the questions would be, why are the brothers going back to Egypt at all? The only obvious reason is that when we saw earlier, and we can see it up here, that when the entourage left, only the children, their flocks, and their herds were left in the land of Goshen. Was that for their convenience, or was that ransom? Was that to make sure they would come back? And one of the questions is, why is it important for them to come back? Does Joseph just want his family there because they're his brothers? His father's already dead, and they've just come from burying him back in the land of Canaan. And it doesn't seem like he has such a great relationship with his brothers. Does he just want them close? What's the risk of having them far away? Since there's no famine, there seems to be no economic reason for them not to stay in the land of Canaan, where they're from, other than the fact that their animals and their children are in Egypt. And nothing is said about why, and we hear nothing from the brothers about how they're feeling about this whole thing until just about in this scene, as we see, when suddenly the long-buried fear comes bursting out. So let's put our scene up here and we'll jump right in. So after he had buried his father, as if it was him alone. You can also be rid of shifting to his perspective here, but we don't see the brother's perspective anywhere until the very next verse. So after he buried his father, Joseph returned to Egypt. No location is given, so the question of Goshen or wherever else is not relevant here. With his brothers, who just seemed to be along for the ride, and all who had gone up. Notice they're not named as Egyptians here. And that would also include Joseph's house, as we saw, Jacob's house, and all the Egyptians. But here they're just described generically as all to de-emphasize their Egyptianness and really to put the focus on simply Joseph and his brothers. And now the perspective shifts back to the brothers, and for the first time in many chapters, we hear their perspective. Before we hear it, let's just look at what a couple scholarly approaches are to this last little unit. Westerman, not surprisingly, as I've been using him as a foil throughout this unit for insisting on finding sources and insertions where there aren't any, or at least scholars more recently don't need to find any, says below, as you can see below, there is no cause for the new beginning in 50:15, and is really beyond comprehension, which he continues, can be explained only from its amalgamation with the conclusion of the Jacob story, unquote, in which Jacob's death must be close to the reconciliation scene. But despite his insistence, it can be explained many other ways, and as White explains right below, he says, from the perspective of the central problem of broken communication around which this narrative revolves, however, the last encounter does not appear to be at all superfluous. And I would agree. There's nothing about the language or the scene that suggests it's not part of the flow, and the surprise element is just part of how biblical drama pulls those things out on us. So there's no need for this not to be read as completely consistent with the story we've been seeing. As my note continues below, as it is, it reminds one that one may forgive, but people don't forget. Reconciliation is an ongoing process, not a once-and-for-all event, and there really has been no reconciliation. We've seen that all along. And further, the brothers have not mourned the death of Jacob at all, except that it brings them renewed fear and guilt of punishment by Joseph. Here's the little math of what I was suggesting about the years, that we know earlier that Joseph was 30 when he started gathering grain. Jacob arrived in the third year of the famine when Joseph was 40, which today 7 years of gathering the grain and 3 years of the famine made him 40. Now 17 more years have gone by and he's 57, makes it the round 40. 57 minus 40 is 17, back to when they started. So a round Exodus wilderness time, if you will, for the brothers. And perhaps that's intentional, although it's not stated in the text. One just has to calculate it. So let's just jump into their perspective. So the text says realizing, but it's actually seeing, and I've translated that over here. So it's not knowing, it's seeing. Seeing that their father was dead. Notice his father, and then they'll say your father. But for the moment, it's their father. And when they buried him, it was their father. The sons did as he had ordered. They were all together. No distinction between Joseph and the brothers. So when they saw that their father was dead, which of course they saw before they left for Egypt, before they left for Canaan, and have known for a while now, but it's the first time we're hearing their perspective. Joseph's brothers said, notice named as Joseph's brothers, what if Joseph still bears a grudge against us and pays us back in full for all the wrong we did to him? Let's look at a little different translation on the right side. What if Joseph still bears a grudge against us and returns, yes, returns on us for all the evil that we did to him? And it's an interesting perspective. They still feel so guilty because, yes, they sold Joseph into slavery. Yes, they lied to their father about that, although Joseph doesn't necessarily know about that. And yes, they were considering killing him. They didn't kill him, of course, but Joseph has hardly treated them well throughout this whole time, too. He's lied to them viciously by saying they were spies, by pretending, of course, that they didn't know who he was, by putting the silver back in the bag and making them look like thieves, both to their father and to the Egyptians, etc. So Joseph has treated them terribly. He has, in fact, paid them back for all the wrong. Have they not realized that at this point, once he revealed himself to them? Perhaps they're just enthralled to his authority. And perhaps, as some scholars suggest, it's part of the second dream. They dreamed that they would bow down to him, and that's more or less what's happening here. But are they really beholden to Joseph's dream? Certainly not consciously, but if it's in them, it's been in them for their entire adult lives. So pays us back, as I was noting, is returns. And the returns is nice because it's suggesting a biblical sense of what we might call karma from a different cultural context of getting back what one deserved for one's evil. And so here we see what happens. And curiously, or maybe not curiously in terms of their character, the only way they can see to defend themselves is to lie about what their father said. At least as far as we know nothing about this being said. And it's not the only lie in this last part of the story as well. So they didn't approach Joseph, they ordered Joseph. They literally gave this order to follow Jacob's order, which has not been reported. Some other translations have sent a messenger, suggesting they don't have the courage to approach him directly, but this is going with that. They not only have the courage to approach him, they have the courage to order him. And order is twice here, for approach and for instruction, curiously. So they ordered Joseph, saying, your father, not our father. They will appeal not on the brother union as children, but as we see in the next verse, as servants or slaves of the God of your father. Not our family God, not the God we worship, but the God, not even your God, but the God of your father. Your father gave us this order before he died, or literally in the face of death, which certainly would give it authority. And that's certainly what they're claiming, that how could Joseph ignore this message from their father? But they're just making it up as far as we know. Westermann notes the explicit language of sin and forgiveness is piled up here, which was deliberately avoided in chapter 45. That was too soon, and they were too much deer in the headlights at that point to do anything about it. And the famine was still going. They were still in need of food, but they're not now. So this is the lie, apparent lie they quote. Jacob saying, say to Joseph, I beg you, or literally as you see, please. And I want to highlight the please here because we saw earlier in the chapter, that's how Joseph spoke to the house of Pharaoh. Please, if I have found favor, please speak to Pharaoh's ear. So now they're in the same position in relation to Joseph as Joseph was in relation to Pharaoh's house. So please forgive the crime of your brothers. And let's look more detailed at the words here. Literally, anasa is lift up. So in that sense of remove. Forgive in Greek in the New Testament is a matter of letting go of something you're holding on to and letting go. Here in the Hebrew Scripture, which it's 47 times in Genesis, but it's for all kinds of other things of lifting up other than forgiving. So lift up here. And the word pesha is only one other time in Genesis. We can go back and see it there. You can see here, what is my offense? And we see pesha there. And here's the only other time. So that was Jacob to Laban. And now it's supposedly Jacob to the brothers speaking to Joseph. So there he continues. Therefore, please forgive the crime of the servants. Notice twice. Please forgive and please forgive. All they change here is who they are, from your brothers to the servants of the God of your father. Should we imagine some little space in between there? Usually when there's a space in between there, the narrator intervenes by saying something like they also said, to highlight there was a moment where Joseph was considering it, or they were considering it, and decided to offer an even more subservient response, no longer brothers but servants. But there is no space there, so apparently it's just them offering an alternative out of their fear. The slaves of the God of your father. And the God of your father we see a number of times here. This is the last one, but we'll see it in Exodus when Moses meets Yahweh at the burning bush. But there's no Yahweh in this story. And Joseph wept when they spoke to him. And this is the last weeping. We saw weeping back in 45. We saw weeping earlier in this chapter as well. As my note below has, in view of his previous efforts to reconstruct the past so as to enable all of Jacob's sons to move forcefully onto a common future, Joseph realizes now that the brothers' inability to break free completely of the structure of the past arises out of their alienation from this new understanding of past events. Thus, Joseph reacts in the only way possible for him. He cries. Whether we agree that that's what Joseph realizes is up to us as readers, because it doesn't say anything about it. It simply says that he cries. It doesn't say he forgives them. It simply says they cry. And as we continue, let's be careful to note what is said and what isn't said about the future relationship with them, which we don't see narrated at all, but we know when this book is over in just a few verses, they'll be in slavery in Egypt, or at least their next generation will be, a next generation that's described in our immediate passage that we'll look at in the next and final video for Genesis. So we see here, on this understanding of the words of verses 16 and 17 as the words of a messenger, they now appear live for the first time. So if 16 and 17 were a messenger message, then they just show up. But there's no reason to think that. That's just what some of the different versions in the Hebrew had. But we're going with the one here that they ordered and came directly. So his brothers also wept and fell down before him, a final fulfillment of the dream in chapter 37, that they would fall down before him. And they say, we are here as your slaves, which is really quite a thing. In chapter 47, Joseph got the Egyptian to say, we are your slaves, because Joseph provided food and saved their lives. But the brothers' lives are not at risk here. What are they afraid is going to happen? If Joseph wanted to kill them, wouldn't he have killed them long ago? Jacob wouldn't have known any more than Jacob knew about what they did to Joseph with the goat's blood on the coat. They could have killed Joseph and still brought back the goat's blood coat. Instead, they sold him. But Jacob wouldn't have known, and Jacob is dead now. And so why is this? Why would they want to be his slaves? All we can imagine is they're enthralled to the propaganda of empire here, because they could still just take their children and their animals and go home. There's no reason to think they can't. And Joseph hasn't prohibited them from it. It's simply been an invitation that life is better in Egypt, and they seem to have bought into it. And here's his response. Notice he doesn't say, I forgive you or I don't forgive you. He says instead, do not be afraid. We see do not be afraid a number of times, and it frames his response. He says it again here in verse 21. Am I in the place of God? I'd like to that's the question of the entire Joseph story there. It's amazing how many readers answered that yes, based on what? On Joseph's word. That's all. God is never an active character in this story at all. We saw in the very early parts when Joseph was in the dungeon that God was with him passively, but we never saw that Joseph reached out to be in a relationship with God, either when he was suffering or certainly not when he was in power in Egypt. He is exactly placing himself in the place of God. It recalls Jacob angrily saying that to Rachel when she couldn't have children. But here, precisely, the monarchical question is at issue throughout the story of a brother ruling over his brothers. And that's really the question for the reader. Can any human being who's in power in this kind of imperial way, holding power together with violence and deceit, be in the place of God? Is that how God holds people together? Certainly not in Genesis, which is all involved with a non-violent provision from God. And the only violence we saw was when Abraham had to rescue Lot from Sodom back in chapter 14. But that was not divinely authorized as far as we heard, and it certainly wasn't divinely ordered. It's in texts like Deuteronomy and the Deuteronomistic tradition that we'll see at the end of the videos here on Genesis that the pattern at the end of Genesis matches exactly the pattern at the end of 2 Samuel, continues into Exodus as 2 Samuel continues into 1 Kings, and raises some real questions about the relationship of the two stories. So hang in there for we'll get to that. But that's really one of the questions of being in the place of God, because the question of David or Solomon being in the place of God as the king is also at issue in those texts. So we'll come back to that question that Joseph acts rhetorically here, presuming the answer is no. But the answer is he's acting like he is, but the answer certainly is no, he's not. And then he continues here. Even though you intended to do harm or intended to do evil, as you can see on the other side here, right here, God intended for good. How does he know what God's intention is? Let's just consider that for a second. The word hashivah here, as in 15:6, God credited to Abraham as righteous, or Abram at that point as righteousness, that he trusted in God before the covenant, as many Protestant Christian theologians have taken that in reading Paul's understanding of it in Galatians. We don't need to go there for that. But what would lead Joseph to think this is God's intention? What it would take for this to be God's intention was to say, God reneges on the promise of the land of Canaan, reneges on the promise of the people being in direct relationship with Yahweh and provision of Yahweh from the earth, but has changed God's mind to allow them to be under imperial control in the land of Egypt. And if not for that, they would not become a numerous people. But is that so? What about all the indigenous Canaanites? They're numerous peoples as far as we know. And after Exodus, when they go back into the land, all those people are certainly there. That's the warning that Moses gives in Deuteronomy 7 about not being infected like a virus, as we would say. They didn't know about viruses, obviously, by those indigenous peoples. So there's no sense that the peoples in the land all died off. Otherwise, there'd be no conquest stories. There'd be no need for a book of Joshua. It really would have been empty land, according to the mythology of entering the land there and the mythology of the British entering North America. Neither of them were empty, of course. And so from the perspective of Genesis, this is plainly a radically wrong theology, that God intended them to be in the land of Canaan, to be free of all the various imperial oppressions, and to rely directly for God for food and true security. But they buy into it, as he is doing today, proclaiming it's not just the past, but now. And so he concludes by saying, have no fear, for a second time, I myself will provide for you and your little ones, your children. What an amazing statement that is. Has Joseph forgotten that the only power he has is delegated by Pharaoh, and the only power Pharaoh has is because of the fertility of the Nile, which is God's creation, but is harnessed by slavery, by imperial slavery. Whatever is in Joseph, he's certainly drunk his own Kool-Aid at this point and become a full part of the Egyptian situation. And as we'll see next time, he remains in Egypt with no sense that he has anywhere else to live. He could go home with them now too. They could be one happy family in Canaan, but that's not what happened. And the narrator comments on it this way, but from Joseph's perspective. In this way, he reassured them, not him, or comforted them, as Walter Brueggemann suggests, an exile-ending word, as we see in Isaiah 41:2. Let's look at that for a minute. The classic comfort, O comfort my people, says your God. Speak tenderly to Jerusalem, and both those speak tenderly and comfort are in our immediate passage in Genesis, and cry to her that she served her term. Her penalty is paid, that she received from the Lord's hand double for all her sins, and the voice cries out in the wilderness to make the way back to Jerusalem. Joseph could have said that here. He could have reassured them and said, I hold nothing against you, we're all good. But he doesn't say that. It doesn't say he forgave them. All it says is he will provide for them, perhaps like David said he'd provide for Saul's son at the royal table, and perhaps like the book of 2 Kings ends with the Babylonians providing for the king of Jerusalem as well. In other words, it's imperial control provision here, not the free provision that God provides directly from the earth. Speaking kindly to them, or literally speaking to the concerns of their hearts. And as my final note on this section as below, it's utterly BS political propaganda. Why should they settle in Egypt now with their father dead and the famine over? But we don't hear their response. And so Genesis conclude next time with the end of Joseph's life, recognizing another half century goes by with their living with Joseph in Egypt. See you for that next time.